It was the penultimate day of Frostfall, 4th Era 171. The verdant forests and meadows of Tamriel's heartland had turned to shades of umber and scarlet. Soon the frigid embrace of winter would leave the trees gnarled and bare. But for now, through frosted breath, the Imperials witnessed a unique beauty in their homeland of Cyrodiil. From atop the Imperial city's western watchtowers, the guards observed as a covered cart rolled along the Red Ring Road, before passing through the village of Way and crossing the bridge to the citadel. Just as the bleak winds would soon strip the landscape of life, something portentous was approaching the bastion of Imperial civilization. Leading the cart was an elf in the distinctive garb of the Old Merry Dominion. He claimed to be an ambassador, but the men patrolling the watchtowers high above sensed that something was awry. This was no diplomat. This was a harbinger of death. As the cart passed the Chestnut Handy stables, the horses became agitated. At the gates to the Talos Plaza district, a guard approached the foreign messenger. Words were exchanged, and a long scroll of parchment was presented. The ambassador had come with an ultimatum. The list of demands included staggering tributes, the disbandment of the Blades, the outlawing of Talos worship, and the ceding of large sections of Hammerfell to the Dominion. The ambassador was treated with cautious courtesy as the Emperor and his most trusted generals examined the ultimatum. Titus Mede II's advisors warned him that their military was weak. Mede had ascended to the throne 3 years prior, and he'd inherited an empire that was far from its historic greatness. Since the Oblivion crisis, Cyrodiil had never truly recovered. The Heartland had faced the brunt of the calamity, and the empire had lost its already tenuous grasp on Blackmarsh. Hammerfell was plagued with civil war, and any hope of a positive relationship with Morrowind was lost when Uriel Septim VII withdrew his men from the east. The Dominion, on the other hand, came off better than most in the wake of Dagon's invasion. They'd bolstered their forces, and brought both Valenwood and elsewhere into the fold. The Empire was vulnerable, and the Dominion was galvanised into action. These favourable circumstances made the Elves of Somerset bold beyond Titus Mede's belief. He rejected the ultimatum, for it truly was an insult to the great empire of men. But not even the sickly scent in the air could have prepared him and the gathered Imperials for what came next. The ambassador's feigned conciliatory demeanour vanished, as if this eventuality was inevitable, and he was suddenly elated over the spectacle he was about to unveil. With a flourish, the Dominion's messenger gestured to the Mer behind the cart, who upended it before the onlookers. From beneath the cover, more than 100 severed heads spilled onto the cobbles. The stench was repugnant, and even in the cool of autumn, there was a swarm of flies, and the faces of the deceased were crawling with maggots. Sprawled before the Emperor were the heads of every Blades agent in all of Somerset and Valenwood. And so began the Great War which would consume the Empire and the Old Merry Dominion for the next 5 years. Hey guys, it's Drew here, and welcome back to Fudge Muppet. Conflict between man and Mer is as inexorable as the rising and setting of the sun. In the mortal realm, times of peace are fleeting. The Old Merry Dominion has existed 3 times in history. The first was during the chaotic interregnum period, and was founded with the intention of unifying Tamriel under Elven rule. This goal was never achieved, and the Dominion dissolved. The second iteration sprang up 300 years later with similar aims, but the might of Tiber Septim put an end to any grand elven ambitions. The third Old Merry Dominion differs from its predecessors in one key way. It has been considerably more successful thus far, and as of the 201st year of the 4th Era, no faction on Tamriel wields as much power. The significance of this is striking, especially when viewed through the lens of the parabolic Cowper. If you happen to watch the Fudge Muppet podcast, you might have heard us talk about this theory before, but in essence, the gravity of events in the Calpic cycle is most potent at the beginning and the end of the cycle. The further time passes into the middle, the less magical and ultimately consequential things become. Simply put, you can imagine it like a parabola, or an inverted bell curve. In the Dawn Era, gods walked Dawn's beauty, and events of immense importance took place. Then, when the cycle of time eventually resets, and Tamriel faces its metaphorical dusk, events should be equally important. If we apply this notion to the wars of Men and Mer, then the seriousness of the Great War and its fallout should not be underestimated. In the Dawn Times, the old and wandering Elnathay, the progenitors to the elves and humans, fought in a devastating war. The elves were victorious, but it was not a total victory. Auriel could not save Altmora, the Elder Wood, and it was lost to men. They were chased south and east to Old Elnathay, and Lorkhan was close behind. He shattered that land into many. Finally, Trinomac, Auriel's greatest knight, knocked Lorkhan down in front of his army and reached in with more than hands to take his heart. He was undone. The men dragged Lorkhan's body away and swore blood vengeance on the heirs of Auriel for all time. The Dawn Era was simultaneously the conclusion and the genesis of the mortal world. Trinomac's fatal blow to the leader of humankind was an ending, but when Trinomac and Auriel tried to destroy the heart of Lorkhan, it laughed at them. It said, "This heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other." Thus, Lorkhan's defeat was only the beginning. As of the fourth era in Tamriel, the Kalpa has come within a hair's breadth of apocalypse on multiple occasions. Two major examples being the Oblivion crisis and the return of Alduin the World-Eater. Some would say that Tamriel is long overdue for its death and rebirth. For now, I'll stay focused on the topic of the Great War, but this metaphysical theory could prove to be essential to the current state of the Thalmor, the Empire, and Tamriel. The conclusion of the Great War seemed decisive, but beneath the surface, it was anything but decisive. I should point out that, in the real world, the First World War was once called the Great War. It was even called the War to End All Wars, a name that surprisingly hasn't stuck. The Treaty of Versailles was signed, and many believed that Europe would be at peace. But in reality, this treaty left a sour taste in the mouths of the Germans. The terms of the agreement of course favoured the victorious Allied nations, and Germany was subsequently plunged into turmoil by the exorbitant demands that they could never truly satisfy. Sounds an awful lot like the White Gold Concordat to me. Only after the rise of the Nazi Party and the Second World War did the title of Great War give way to the First World War. Who's to say that won't be the case here? If you think that the Great War of Tamriel came to an amicable conclusion, then you haven't been paying attention. So let's break down the major events of the Great War spanning 4th Era 171 to 175, as well as the lead up to it. The Oblivion crisis of course left every race of Tamriel licking their wounds, perhaps with the exception of the Argonians. As I said, the High Elves were spared the brunt of Dagon's blows, but they by no means got off unscathed. The pinnacle of Altmeri culture, the Crystal Tower, was made a target of Dagon's Daedra hordes. According to the text Rising Fret, written from the perspective of a High Elven refugee, it started like a gust rustling through the leaves of a dense forest, but the sound did not taper off. It rose into a roar as the very ground on which I stood began to shudder. I turned to look, and the world held its breath. I stood transfixed as the heart of my homeland was torn as if from my own breast. The unthinkable, the incomprehensible, the tower of crystal-like law cast to the ground, with all the dignity of a beggar meeting an ironclad fist. This same refugee, named Lafanil of Sunhold, details the clever scheming of the Thalmor, who utilised the trying times to take control of Somerset. They were there, dripping honeyed poison in our ears, the Thalmor. They were the ones that saved us, they claimed, working deep and subtle magics. It was their efforts, their sacrifices that delivered the Ultima from extinction. The Ultima are notorious for perpetuating the idea of elven superiority. Some High Elves denounce it, others believe it but don't discriminate against lessers, while the Thalmor actively propagate supremacy and xenophobia. And it was this faction that would take command of the Altmeri Dominion. In 4th Era 22, the Thalmor controlled Somerset. In 4th Era 29, the Thalmor backed a coup to overthrow the presiding government in Valenwood, routing all imperial influence from the region, while officially uniting to form the Third Altmeri Dominion. All they needed now was elsewhere. For some time, the Thalmor focused their efforts on weakening the Empire, until the perfect opportunity presented itself. In 4th Era 98, the moons mysteriously disappeared, and no race was affected quite like the Khajiit. These Void Nights lasted 2 years, and upon the return of the moons, the Falmor claimed credit, asserting that they brought Joan and Jode back with the use of dawn magics. By 4th Era 115, the grateful kingdoms of Anakinna and Palatine were client states of the Dominion. The elves took their time securing their hold over southwestern Tamriel, and prepared for conquest. In 4th Era 171, Titus Mede II refused the ultimatum, and unsurprised by this revelation, the Dominion mobilized. Within days, 2 Aldmeri armies invaded the Empire's lands. The first, led by the Falmor general Lord Narafin, emerged from a series of hidden camps in northern and eastern elsewhere. The first goal was to press west and flank the Imperial defences stationed along the Valenwood border, securing a clear passage for the Second Army. Shortly after, Narafin's forces captured a largely unprepared Leowin and laid siege to Breville. The Dominion's years of preparation had caught the Empire sleeping, and before the Imperials could find their footing, they'd already ceded a huge chunk of their homeland. In no time at all, the heart of the Empire was in danger, and from a vantage point, Narafin would have been able to see the top of the White Gold Tower on the horizon, a milestone that should have taken much longer. The Second Army, led by Lady Arenelia, pushed from the now undefended treeline of Valenwood into western Cyrodiil, but bypassed Anvil and Kvatch altogether, crossing the border into Hammerfell. This of course was a risky manoeuvre, even with the Empire's lacklustre response, as they were leaving enemy strongholds between them and their retreat. The Dominion, however, had no intent to retreat, as a second invasion of troops was occurring on Hammerfell's southern coastline. Hammerfell was not unified, and the Red Guards were not expecting to be the primary target of the Aldmeri assault, especially not from 2 fronts, one of which being their allied border with Cyrodiil. So, despite the reputation of Red Guards being tremendous warriors, they simply could not cope with the coordinated onslaught of the Dominion. The Imperial legions posted in southern Hammerfell, with the aid of the native Red Guards, offered scattered resistance, but were quickly overrun. Over the following months, Rahad, Tanith and Ghislaine all fell. Only Hagath held out against the besieging Aldmeri forces. The Dominion had included chunks of southern Hammerfell in the ultimatum presented to Titus Mede II, and it appeared that they had already succeeded in taking them by conquest. The surviving Imperials and Red Guards, who were not safe behind the high walls of Hagath, were forced to retreat north across the Alakir Desert, in an event that is now famously remembered as the March of First. Meanwhile, Narafin's forces in the Heartland were edging closer to the Imperial city. The Aldmeri Dominion's 2-pronged attack had been a resounding triumph. The question now was, could they deliver the killing blow to the Empire, while also consolidating their gains in Hammerfell, pacifying the resolute Red Guards? There is speculation that the initial objective of the Great War was the conquest of Hammerfell. The push into Cyrodiil was intended to distract the bulk of the Imperial forces, pinning them down on the home front so that Lady Arenelia's progress would not be hindered. But with the success of Narafin's advance into Cyrodiil, the Dominion realised that the Empire was even weaker than they'd first fought. So, due to the lack of staunch resistance, the stakes of the Great War may have just been raised. Hammerfell was still the goal, but the likelihood of taking the ultimate prize, the White Gold Tower, was too tantalising to pass up. Was Lord Narafin up to the task, or would the Aldmeri Dominion be foiled by greed and hubris? In 4th Era 172, Narafin took both Breville and Anvil, and by Evening Star, Aldmeri forces had steadily advanced to the banks of Lake Rumer. Only the walls of the Imperial city stood between the Dominion and the total destruction of the Empire. Ferocious naval battles were fought in the lake and along the Niben. The waters ran as red as the Imperial banners draped over the city walls. Reinforcing legions had arrived from Skyrim in 4th Era 173, but even the bolstered ranks were not sufficient to quell the Aldmeri advance. By the end of the year, the city was surrounded on 3 sides, leaving only the road north to Bruma open to the defenders. Meanwhile in Hammerfell, a forebear army descended from Sentinel and broke the siege of Hagath. This helped to unify the usually hostile crowns and forebears, at least for now. But Arenelia delivered a counterblow, taking the central northern city of Skaven. Unfortunately for the Dominion, crossing the Alakir in the process took its toll. The harsh landscape whittled away at their numbers, and supply lines were growing precariously thin. It seemed that Lady Aranelia's forces had achieved all they could in the west. Prospects of a breakthrough were now squarely in Narafin's hands. In 4th Era 174, the Dominion committed all available forces to the Cyrodiilic campaign. They were gambling on total victory over the Empire of Men. Should it fail, the hopes of successfully integrating their conquered territory in Hammerfell would likely fall apart, and Aranelia's army would be compelled to retreat. Once the reinforcements arrived, Lord Narafin launched his pivotal assault on the citadel. One army drove north to surround the city, while the main force attacked from the east, south and west. Defense of the city was doomed, and Titus Mede II had no choice but to abandon his imperial seat. Mede broke out of the city to the north with his main army, smashing through the widely spread Aldmeri forces. His only hope was to link up with reinforcements marching south from Skyrim under General Jonna. Narafin claimed the imperial city, and rumour has it that the Dominion forces were not magnanimous in victory. The infamous sack of the imperial city began, the imperial palace was burned, the White Gold Tower itself was looted, and all manner of atrocities were carried out by the vengeful elves on the innocent populace. General Decianus, who was busy orchestrating the recapture of Skaven, was ordered to march east towards Cyrodiil, but he left ample men to harass Lady Aranelia's invaders. The army that remained did more than harass the Aldmeri forces. By the end of the year 174, they drove the Dominion back across the Alakir. One arm of the Aldmeri invasion was severed, and now Lord Narafin was faced with a sobering revelation. Yes, he'd captured the imperial city. Yes, he'd dethroned the Emperor and sullied their sacred halls and temples. But now his prize might also be his prison, because the war was not yet won. Emperor Titus Mede II took refuge in the Dural Mountains, and when negotiating with the Dominion, gave the clear impression that his formal surrender was impending. However, Mede used this time to rally his troops. General Decianus had arrived from Hammerfell, and his men were ordered to hide in the Clovian highlands west of the imperial city. General Jonna's Nord forces circled the city from the east, and the Emperor's own main army marched directly on the city, approaching from the northern face. And so the stage was set for the final fateful clash, the Battle of the Red Ring. Decianus swept down from the highlands. Jonna's forces drove all the way around the city, crossing the Niben to join flanks with Decianus. The city was surrounded. Narafin's garrisons at Skingrad and Breville attacked the Imperial forces from the rear, but their numbers were quickly overwhelmed. Titus Mede's army penetrated the city first, and the Aldmeri evacuation from the city south was halted by Jonna's battered and resilient Nords. Narafin's army was no more, and the punishment for defiling the Imperial city was brutal. Lord Narafin was kept alive for 33 days, hanging from the White Gold Tower. The Dominion lost the battle, but despite the joy of the Imperial forces following their victory against the odds, the reality remained that they would still have to capitulate to the Aldmeri ultimatum. Titus Mede II had been vindicated, and his reputation had been restored, but he could not continue to wage war with the Dominion. What followed was the White Gold Concordat, an end to the war that satisfied no one, and made subsequent conflict inexorable. As presented in the ultimatum 4 years prior, Talos worship was to be outlawed in all imperial provinces, and while most of this territory was already under Aldmeri occupation, large portions of southern Hammerfell were to be ceded to the Dominion. You'd think the Dominion would be pleased with this outcome, and the Empire would be grateful to still have most of its land, as well as time to recoup. After all, Talos worship was not historically essential, at least to the imperial pantheon of the Divines. But neither side would get what they wanted. The Red Guards rightfully perceived themselves to be the worst off. The Emperor had given away considerable chunks of their homeland, without even consulting them. So the men of Hammerfell fought on alone, invigorated by the successful recapture of Skaven a year prior. Due to the breach of the treaty, Titus Mede II was forced to renounce Hammerfell from his empire entirely. The Red Guards fought valiantly, and as such, negotiated a much more favourable agreement with the Dominion, in the form of the Second Treaty of Stros Mackay in 4th Era 180. This treaty saw the Aldmeri occupants withdraw completely from Hammerfell. So, in terms of territory, both the Dominion and the Empire suffered. Titus Mede II's hold on Tamriel was now decreased to Cyrodiil, High Rock and Skyrim, while the Dominion had technically achieved nothing in terms of land annexed. As for Talos worship, both sides suffered again. The Dominion had to go to great lengths to ensure the terms of the treaty were being adhered to, while the Empire was plunged into another war with Ulfric's Stormcloaks. In the words of Legate Justianus Quintius, on the topic of the Great War's conclusion, there can be no doubt that the current peace cannot last forever. The Thalmor take the long view, as is proved by the sequence of events leading up to the Great War. All those who value freedom over tyranny can only hope that before it is too late, Hammerfell and the Empire will be reconciled and stand united against the Thalmor threat. Otherwise, any hope to stem the tide of Thalmor rule over all of Tamriel is dimmed. When we left Tamriel in 4th Era 201, the apocalyptic end to Tamriel at the claws of Alduin had been averted, and the civil war had been settled. When it comes to predicting how the inevitable Second Great War will transpire, the outcome of Skyrim's civil war is crucial. There is no doubt that the Thalmor relished in the devastation wrought by the conflict. Every casualty on both sides weakened potential foes. To the Thalmor members watching intently from their embassy, it was like seeing Titus Mede II's main army from the Battle of the Red Ring squaring off against General Jonna's shield wall. The Empire was waging war with its own reinforcements. But if we accept that renewed conflict between the Dominion and the remaining factions of men is unavoidable, then how will it play out? To properly answer that, we must establish motivation. And I'm going to ask for permission to speculate a little. Or actually, no, speculate a lot, calling upon a grand conspiracy that we've discussed often on the channel. I say conspiracy, but that's a bit of a disservice, because there is a lot of evidence to support this theory. But due to the fact that the Thalmor have never explicitly revealed their motives, I will preface the rest of this video with the speculation disclaimer. First things first, I think we can all agree that the Dominion's ambitions do not end at southern Hammerfell. The Thalmor didn't scheme for 2 centuries over the acquisition of the largely barren peninsula of Hughes Bane. Even the fairly prosperous cities of Hagath, Ghislaine, Tanith and Rihard are not valuable enough to justify the lengths the Dominion has gone to since the Oblivion crisis. The Outlaw of Talos worship comes closer to revealing their true intentions. The decision to ban his worship specifically is beneficial for multiple reasons. Elves generally believe themselves to be closer to their Aedric ancestors than men are. This sentiment is especially prevalent among the elven supremacist Thalmor. The Dominion could easily have forced Titus Mede II to disavow Stendarr, for he is the apologist of men. But the Thalmor chose Talos because they knew full well that banning his worship would cause conflict between the Empire and their Nordic vassals. The men of Skyrim hold Talos in particularly high esteem since the legendary Atmoran general conquered Tamriel. So, in one move, the High Elves took revenge against a figure who had once defeated them. They undermined a god of men, and they incited internal strife among the Empire's northern vassals, effectively severing their control over one of Cyrodiil's 2 remaining allies. As I said, there is no way the Dominion would be appeased after acquiring southern Hammerfell. If that were the case, why bother to sow seeds of unrest among the Nords in the distant north? It's perfectly plausible that the Aldmeri Dominion simply wished to conquer the entirety of Tamriel. Total domination of the continent, replacing the factions of men with elves, is enough motivation in itself. After all, the High Elves have always valued heritage. They have always endeavoured to uphold traditions and maintain cultural consistency since the earliest days of their existence. The First Era was the era of men, but back in the Merethic era, elves ruled Tamriel, hence the name Merethic, which translates from Nordic as the era of the elves. If this simple ambition of an elven empire reigning over the continent is the only one, then it would certainly make sense for the Dominion to choose Hammerfell as the primary target. Theoretically, they could sunder the Empire from its western allies. Then they could turn on Skyrim, encircling Cyrodiil on 3 sides, leaving only the treacherous swamps of Blackmarsh and the ash-choked chaos of Morrowind. The Empire would find no allies in these lands. Alternatively, as we saw unfold in the wake of the White Gold Concordat, the Dominion may not have had to worry about severing Skyrim's connection to Cyrodiil, for the prohibition of Talos worship handled it for them, causing the provinces to turn on one another. So, judging by the events of the Great War, we can't write off conquest as the one and only motivator for the Thalmor. But I believe there is another major motive, a prize far more valuable than even the Imperial City. That motive is control over the Tower, Adamantia, Tower Zero, or as it is often called, the Adamantine Tower, the oldest and most hallowed structure in all of Mundus. However you look at it, the Dominion did not merely wish to annex southern Hammerfell, they planned to gather their strength here and press on across the desert and the craggy Badlands to the shores of the Iliac Bay. As things currently stand, the Dominion are no longer occupying Hammerfell, but progress has been made in Skyrim. The Civil War weakened the Empire considerably, regardless of the outcome, and Titus Mede II was almost certainly assassinated by a member of the Dark Brotherhood, leaving the Empire practically incapable of opposing the Dominion. If, on top of all of this, Ulfric Stormcloak's rebellion succeeded, which is of course speculation, as nothing will be confirmed until the Elder Scrolls 6, then the Aldmeri Dominion would find themselves in an even more advantageous position. The driving force behind the Stormcloak Uprising was clear and twofold. They sought religious freedom and political independence for the Nords of Skyrim. I think it's reasonable to deduce from the political cunning the Thalmor employ when dealing with other races, that they would come to a cordial agreement with High King Ulfric, permitting Talos worship and complete control over Skyrim so long as the Nords did not meddle with Dominion affairs elsewhere. These positive negotiations seem even more likely if you believe what was written in the infamous Thalmor dossier, which refers to Ulfric as an asset, one which they intended to save from execution at Helgen, were it not for the intervention of Alduin. Even if you don't buy into the idea that Ulfric is in any form an asset of the Dominion, there is little he can truly do about their predominance in Tamriel. After the Battle of Solitude, Ulfric says this to Galmar: "The Empire is weak, obsolete. Look at how far we've come and with so little. When we're done rooting out Imperial influence here at home, then we will take our war to the Aldmeri Dominion." But as Legate Rick states a few moments prior, "You're wrong, Ulfric. We need the Empire. Without it, Skyrim will assuredly fall to the Dominion." I'm inclined to side with the Legate on this one. The Skyrim Civil War is an incredibly even affair. The Stormcloaks were not able to conquer their own homeland convincingly from an empire that Ulfric refers to as weak and obsolete. So if the Thalmor offer Ulfric terms that involve Talos worship and political independence, then I think he would be forced to acquiesce, even if he makes a display of feigned belligerence in the process. Another factor is, would the Thalmor be willing to capitulate on Talos worship after they worked so hard to have it outlawed? In my personal opinion, the success of their conquest takes precedence over the banning of Talos. In their eyes, lifting the ban would only be temporary. The Thalmor dossier also emphasises that the Thalmor would only assist the rebels so long as the conflict remained indecisive. A prolonged and bloody civil war was clearly more important to the Dominion than a favourable outcome or the punishment of Talos worshippers. But as I was saying, the Thalmor will clearly aid adversaries if it benefits them in the grand scheme, and a quietly content Skyrim would bode much better for a second Aldmeri invasion of Hammerfell than an agitated Skyrim looking for any excuse to turn on the elves. With Skyrim pacified, the Dominion would assuredly press into southern Hammerfell again with a more significant army. The capture of Stros M'Kai would be paramount for establishing a foothold, followed by the southern cities of Hagath, Ghislain, Tanith and Rahad. Even if the Empire succeeded in quashing the Stormcloak rebels, they would not be able to put up the same degree of resistance they had in the First Great War, and that initial resistance had been inadequate to begin with. Taking the northern cities, including the capital of Sentinel, would be no easy task. The Dominion would have to rely on the historic rivalry between the Bretons and Redguards to prevent reinforcements crossing the Iliac Bay. But if the Thalmor's end goal is on Isle Balfiera, then they should be able to placate the High Rock Kingdoms by insisting that no invasion into their holdings would be forthcoming. A post-Skyrim Civil War Tamriel would make the taking of northeastern Hammerfell significantly easier for the Dominion. Cities like Dragonstar and Elenhir would have been nigh impossible in the First Great War. Dragonstar sits right on the tripoint of Hammerfell's border with High Rock and Skyrim, two provinces that were loyal to the Empire at the time and prepared to fight. Now, on the other hand, Skyrim would be in a delicate, but nevertheless existing truce with the Dominion. High Rock would still be aligned with Cyrodiil, but the mountainous expanses of the Craglorn region would stand between High Rock and the dwindled ranks of the Imperials. From here, only a small stretch of sea would separate the Dominion from the Adamantine Tower. As I said, my prediction for the events of the Second Great War relies on the theory that the Thalmor wish to control the Towers of Creation. If total domination of Tamriel were the true motive, then we'd need to talk extensively about the conquest of High Rock, Skyrim, Cyrodiil, Morrowind and Blackmarsh. That would be essentially impossible to predict, due to the sheer number of variables. But in short, if it were to successfully happen, I expect the Dominion would focus on Hammerfell, followed by Cyrodiil before they could regain their strength, then High Rock and Skyrim, before dealing with the Dunmer and Argonians. The Dominion would have to count on the fact that the Dark Elves and Argonians would continue to harass and weaken one another, while the conquest of Western and Central Tamriel took place. But I digress, as I believe the true hidden cause of the First Great War, and the inevitable catalyst for the Second Great War, revolves around the Towers. If you watch the channel regularly, I'm sure you've heard us talk about this theory in detail, but I'll summarise it here. The existence of the Towers, and their enigmatic powers, is undoubtedly canon. The speculation comes from the nature of their powers, and the reason the Thalmor might wish to control them. It is believed that the Towers hold up the world, and keep Lorkhan's mortal realm intact. The High Elves in turn are known for their belief that they are descendants of the Aedra, and that Mundus has trapped them in mortal purgatory. The fundamental theological conflict between elf and man stems from this. Humans thank the gods for allowing them to exist as mortals, while the elves rue their finite forms, and wish to be reunited with their immortal ancestors. Therefore it is theorized that the Thalmor, who subscribe to traditional Ultima religious dogma, wish to destroy the Towers, thus unmaking the mortal realm and freeing their souls to return to the Aedric plane of Aetherius. This is the Thalmor conspiracy, and the reason the Dominion has spent centuries planning their assault on Greater Tamriel and the provinces of men. Each tower has a stone, and by deactivating the stone, the tower loses its power. This much isn't confirmed, but is surmised from the available canonical information. According to Beradalmo the Signifier, in his text The Orbic Enigma 4, there was once only one tower, with one stone, but then the new towers were made with their own stones, in emulation of the first tower and stone. He writes, "The Aldmeri or Malefic elves were singular of purpose, only so long as it took them to realise that other towers, with their own stones, could tell different stories. And so the Mer self-refracted, each to their own creation, the Chimer following red heart, the Bosma burgeoning green sap, the Ultima erecting crystal-like lore, and so on." There is one more part to the theory, and that is the reason the Ultima are so adamant about maintaining their cultural and racial purity. The High Elves believe that diverging from the original Ultima would only take them further away from their goal of restoring their divinity. Michael Kirkbride writes that the Ultima began to split along cultural lines, on how best to spread creation and their parts in it. Each tower that was built exemplified a separate accordance. This sundering of purpose is the myth of the destruction of Aldmeris. So, with all of this in mind, the puzzle starts to piece itself together. The Thalmor wish to return to the heavens, to a time before Lorkhan's mortal trap. The towers represent the sundering of the pure Ultima form, and served only to strengthen Lorkhan's realm, adding new bars to the prison. Therefore, the purpose of the Great War is to control the towers, and to deactivate them. And which tower is the most crucial in realising this ambition? Well, in the words of Beradalmo again, the spike of Adamantia and its zero stone dictated the structure of reality in its orbic vicinity, defining for the Earthbones their story or nature within the unfolding of the dragon's time-bound tale. The Adamantine Tower was not built by man or Mer, it was built by the gods. In the vaults beneath the Ur Tower lies the Zero Stone. Beradalmo writes, "At maturity, every Dureni of high blood is brought into the tower, conducted to the foundation vault, and shown the Zero Stone. We are allowed to touch it, once, so as to feel the transcendent mystical power that courses through it, a power we have never been able to tap. And we are shown the Argent Aperture in the adjacent metallic wall, that door with its lock of 13 slowly counter-rotating rings, a portal we have never been able to open. This is the Thalmor's prize, the impetus for all the bloodshed of the First Great War, and all the blood that will invariably be shed when the fires of war are rekindled. There will be a Second Great War, and it may be the most vital conflict in Tamrielic history. An age ago, when I mentioned the notion of the parabolic Kalpa at the top of the video, I suggested that the most critical events in history take place in the dawn and the dusk of the Kalpic cycle. The Elnathay War of the Dawn era set the foundations for everything that followed, and time will end when a new Elnathay War between men and Mer takes place. That ultimate Elnathay War may just be going on right now. The First Great War ended indecisively, and the Second Great War awaits us in the Elder Scrolls 6. Or so I believe. And there you have it, guys, why there will be a Second Great War. I hope you enjoyed this long and detailed video, and if you've made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for taking this journey with me. My name is Drew, you've been watching Fudge Muppet, and I'll see you in the next one.